On June 29 of this year, Governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla announced in a New York Times interview that the annual debt service on more than $72 billion in bonds that Puerto Rico and its various authorities and cities had issued over the past decades is, and I quote, no longer payable. His government was on the verge of the biggest debt default and bankruptcy in the history of American municipal bonds. This catastrophic news, which has catapulted Puerto Rico to the forefront of media interest over these last months, must be interpreted within the context of a fundamental stagnation of the economy of Puerto Rico that has persisted now for several decades. Tonight, we would like to address the historical, economic, and political impact of the debt crisis in relation to the stagnating economy of Puerto Rico and its colonial relationship to the United States. We do it as part of an ongoing series of moderated discussions that have taken place over the last months at various universities in the New York City area. On October 21st, Frances Negrón organized an event called Commonwealth with the participation of Joseph Stiglitz, Sergio Marzuach, Joel Cintron, and Carla Minet. On October 29th, Arnaldo Curz-Malavé organized an event called Whose Debt? With the participation of Nelson Dennis and Juan González, moderated by Luisita López Torregrosa. And also, on October 21st, Juan González gave a keynote presentation here at the King Juan Carlos Center, which was titled Puerto Rico's Debt Crisis, Economic Collapse in America's Biggest Colony, and What Can Be Done About It. It was an illuminating and very useful presentation. Tonight is also the last event of the series for the fall semester sponsored by the MFA in Creative Writing in Spanish here at NYU. This is also a moderated discussion. I would like to thank Frances Negrón and Arnaldo Curz-Malavé, who have been coordinating this event with me. And now a few short introductory remarks about our participants. Juan González holds the Andrés Bello Chair at the King Juan Carlos Center and is a broadcast journalist and investigative reporter. He is also a columnist for the New York Daily News since 1987. He frequently co-hosts the radio and television program Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. During a career of more than 35 years, Juan González has become one of the nation's best-known Latino journalists. He has authored several books, among them Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media, and Fallout, The Environmental Consequences of the World Trade Center Collapse. Rafael Bernabe is the founder and leader of the Puerto Rican Partido del Pueblo Trabajador, the Puerto Rican Workers' Party, for which he ran for governor in the 2012 election and is running for governor again. Amen. He is also a historian, a cultural and literary critic, and is professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. He is the author of Puerto Rico in the American History, a history since 1898, co-authored with César Ayala, Respuestas al colonialismo en la política puertorriqueña, Manual para organizar velorios, and La maldición de Pedreira, aspectos de la crítica romántico-cultural de la modernidad en Puerto Rico. Frances Negrón-Muntaner is an award-winning Puerto Rican filmmaker, writer, and scholar. Her work is focused on a comparative exploration of coloniality, primarily in Puerto Rico and the United States, with a special attention given to the intersections between race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and politics. She is an associate professor of English and comparative literature and director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. She is the author of Puerto Rican Jam, Rethinking Colonialism and Nationalism, co-edited with Ramon Grosfogel, of Boricua Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American Culture, and she has also edited None of the Above, Puerto Ricans in the Global Era. My co-moderator tonight is Arnaldo Curz-Malavé, who is a professor of English. A professor of Spanish, comparative literature, and Latin American and Latino studies at Fordham University, and director of the Latin American and Latino Studies Institute. He is the author of Queer Latino Testimonio, Keith Haring and Juanito Extravaganza, Hard Tales. Also of El Primitivo Implorante, a book on the works of the Cuban author José Lezama Lima, and co-editor with Martin Manalansan of Queer Globalizations, Citizenship and the Afterlife of Colonialism. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Emory, and the University of Pennsylvania. So, the discussion tonight is organized around some questions that Arnaldo and I prepared. The idea is that every discussant will have 5 minutes to address each question, and each participant will then have a chance to discuss and consider each other's answers, and so on and so on. And we also want to have some time for questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event tonight. So, Arnaldo will start with the first question.
An honor to be here with Rafael, with Frances, with Juan, with Rubén. The first question is actually inspired after the very eloquent and brilliant exposition that Juan did here at the King Juan Carlos. And it's on narratives. I believe it will be coming up, right? Yeah?
Turn the page.
Yes? Okay, yes. It's on the need for new narratives. One of the determining factors in the way people react to the Puerto Rican debt crisis is what we might call, following Jameson loosely, master narratives that frame and predetermine people's interpretations of Puerto Rican society, of Puerto Ricans, and of the crisis. In his recent presentation here, Juan identified as one of the important tasks in dealing with the crisis, the need to develop a clear narrative about it. I will ask, what are the multiple master narratives that currently frame people's understanding of the crisis in the United States and Puerto Rico, among Puerto Ricans in the island and the diaspora, as well as among the American public at large? How can we move away from these narratives? How can we develop alternative, clear narratives? What elements or components would such alternative narratives need to contain or to address?
Can I ask Juan a question?
Sure.
Can you, I didn't hear your talk, so I was just curious when I read that question at home, what do you mean by a clear narrative?
So you get to answer first.
Well, what I mean is a clear understanding of what the crisis is about, and I think that right now what we have is we have contending narratives about the immediate crisis, which is this debt that has accumulated now and that needs to be paid in one way or another. And then we have a reigning narrative about the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. I think both of the major contending narratives we've heard in recent weeks are off base, and certainly the long-term narrative of the relationship. You know, I don't know how many of you drive back and forth across New Jersey, but I always remember when I was driving through Trenton, right, the city of Trenton. They still have that big sign when you cross the bridge, that river going into Trenton. Trenton makes, the world takes, which was from the days when Trenton was a major industrial center. And I think that the master narrative in terms of Puerto Rico is that the United States makes and Puerto Rico takes. And now Puerto Rico wants to take more. And that's the master narrative that needs to be challenged and redefined when it's actually been the other way around. That Puerto Rico has made and the United States has taken for over 100 years in terms of wealth So that we here in the United States have to somehow or other wage a battle over the nature of the knowledge that the American people have in terms of Puerto Rico, and redefine the narrative, the long-term narrative, and then the immediate narrative of who's responsible for the current debt crisis.
The question of narrative, I think it's a complex one, and I would say that in speaking about Puerto Rico, I would divide it into three aspects. There's a basic narrative or basic narratives, and there's a global narrative, and then there's the narratives regarding Puerto Rico as such. And since I only have 5 minutes, I'm going to basically deal in this question with the basic narrative, which does not only apply to Puerto Rico. And that basic narrative has a very, very strong argument within it, which is that debts have to be paid. We are taught that. Debts have to be paid. Not to pay your debts is dishonorable. And the basis of that notion is that debts are incurred involuntarily by borrowers. That is to say, borrowers borrow money, and they should be responsible for paying that debt. If there is a debt crisis, if the debt is a very strong burden, well, that's up to the borrower to make the necessary sacrifices so that the debt can be paid. And that basic idea, which is, I think, very deeply ingrained in our minds, bolsters, it underpins the notion that if there is a debt crisis, it's because government has spent too much, and therefore it has to apply now austerity measures, it has to cut back in its spending. If people have a very high debt, it's because they have been irresponsible, they have lived beyond their means, and now they have to accept austerity measures because they have to pay for the debts that they have taken up. And that, needless to say, this narrative is a narrative which is very convenient. It's very convenient for the creditors. It puts all the burden on the borrower. I think we have to question that narrative. And I think one way of looking at an alternative narrative, which I think has far more explanatory power, is the fact that what stands behind the debt crisis is what I would call the maximum drive, the corporate drive for a maximum profit. It is the search for maximum profit by corporations which limits wages, which has limited income of most people and drives them into debt. And it is the fact that corporations in their search for profit have managed to have taxes reduced, the taxes that they pay, that leads government into deficit and into debt. And if there is much speculation with debt leading to very profound financial crisis, as we know, it's because those very same corporate interests that drive wages down and drive the taxes that they pay down also favor deregulation and therefore lead to the crisis that we have. So whether it's in the front of wage or taxes or regulatory front, what you have behind the debt crisis is not that government spent too much, it's that corporations have been undertaxed. It's not that people have lived beyond their means, it's that their means have been very severely restricted by the economic situation over 3 decades now. So I think that our perspective has to redefine the way that this debt came about. This is not a debt that was taken on voluntarily by people. They have to go into debt, and the government has to go into debt if it doesn't have the resources necessary to provide certain services. In the case of Puerto Rico, the reality, the specific reality of the undertaxing of large corporations takes on a very particular aspect, which is the fact that you could call it the paradox of the Puerto Rican situation, which is that you have an economy which has a tremendous debt, $73 billion debt. You have an economy which has been stagnant for 10 years. It doesn't grow. It has lost, in terms of income, it has lost about a fifth of the jobs that existed in Puerto Rico 10 years ago or have disappeared. But yet, even though it has this debt and even though it doesn't grow, it generates a tremendous amount of profit for about 40 multinational corporations that operate in Puerto Rico. $35 billion in profit that leave the island every year and are not reinvested in Puerto Rico. And that's what's at the center, I would say. That's one of the key factors of the debt. I mean, think of the magnitudes that we're talking about here. The debt is $73 billion, and in 2 years, that amount of money leaves the island in terms of profit of U.S. corporations operating in Puerto Rico. So I would very much agree with Juan that we have to turn the main narrative around. It is not we who owe these creditors. It is these creditors who owe society, not only Puerto Rican society, but all of society, some of the profits that they have gathered, that they have garnered over many decades, and they have not contributed as they should to the economic growth, in this case of Puerto Rico, but I would say even that's also the case in the case of communities in the United States. I don't know how far I am into my 5 minutes, but I have a few more things I could. So I would say that the main, if I were to summarize everything what I'm saying, is that the notion that all debts have to be paid has to be countered with the question of, well, before we agree to pay a debt, we have to find out how that debt was contracted to begin with. How did it originate? What is the origin? What is the history of the debt? And if you look into the origin of the debt in Puerto Rico, I think you can make a very strong argument that this debt has to be audited, it has to be re-examined, and that policies have to be devised in order to pay as much as we can, but not at the cost of social programs and not at the cost of economic development that we need. A few more things to say about what kind of economic development we need, but I will leave that for a further question, so the other speakers can address this issue.
Yeah, I just want to add something in terms of following up on your issue of blaming the debtor. We have our own examples right here. What was the debate over the subprime lending crisis that led to the economic collapse, worldwide economic collapse? That the fault was of the homeowners who took out debt, not of the people who peddled unsound debt to them. And what is the debate we're having right now in terms of the massive student loan debt in the United States? That it's the fault of the students who take out this debt and then don't want to pay it back, not of the private colleges and all these other universities that actually peddle debt to the government. So it's not just in terms of Puerto Rico that this issue of who's responsible for debt occurs.
I'll vote for you.
Okay, thank you. I need it.
Yeah. To me, the first task that I had to think through was the very vocabulary that we were using to describe the situation in the other form. And one of the things that I thought was challenging was precisely identifying what is the crisis, or are there multiple crises. And some of my preliminary conclusions is that we can become very focused on the actual debt crisis, and I think there's already a compelling analysis how to look at that. But it seems to me that another dimension of the crisis, and I feel that I sensed that a crisis was coming about a decade ago, when I started to feel that people in Puerto Rico that I related to were feeling hopeless. To me, one of the most complex and challenging aspects of the crisis is the ways that a large number of Puerto Ricans, if not most, feel that all prior narratives, master narratives, other alternative narratives, have actually failed us. Development narratives certainly have failed us. And that seems to me one of the crises that I particularly want to think about, which is how did we get to that point? And how is it that the most massive response to the debt crisis, the deteriorating conditions, has been to leave Puerto Rico? So that's one dimension of this that I find challenging, that I think that we can generate a new narrative, but the actual process of people acting or mobilizing around the narrative seems pretty formidable. The other dimension of the crisis that I feel very challenged by is that, as Miriam Muñiz has put it, capitalism is crisis in general. So we move from, at least I don't know about you, but I feel we move from crisis to crisis simultaneously. There are multiple crises going on, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the world. We're living in a moment of tremendous crisis of multiple levels. So within that chaotic crisis world, that I would concur that one viable narrative to explain it is that since capitalism is crisis and capitalism regulates the world, so we're pushed from crisis to crisis, fundamentally. But nevertheless, what I'm concerned about is how do we think about crisis in all those dimensions? And I'm not sure that I have reached a point where I feel I have a vocabulary or I have an analysis that allows me to link all these multiple levels of the situation. So I have more questions than I have solutions, and in fact, the whole concept of solution, I find it challenging in the sense that solution suggests that there's a simple problem. So if you have a simple problem, you have a solution. When you have a complex problem, where variables do not relate in cause and effect, where you have simultaneous processes of subordination and subjection at various levels, then I think we're in a situation where we can consider ways of alleviating the debt crisis. I don't think we're going to solve the debt crisis in the sense that Greece is not solving the debt crisis. Argentina is not, didn't solve. I mean, we're talking about a complex problem. So we can, I think, come up with strategies to alleviate matters. We might be able to develop a strategy to get the U.S. to abolish the unincorporated territory doctrine. Although this is where it gets complex, what is going to take its place might be as complicated. So that's part of the complexity. So I guess what I bring to the forum is I have a lot of questions, much more than I have answers. And I think the very process of us being in a room, and that there's been multiple rooms that we've been hanging out, trying to work through this, is perhaps one of the most valuable aspects of the crisis. The possibility of reconstituting ourselves, however we want to define ourselves, into a group that can push towards another horizon that I'm not sure what it is.
In what ways can the debt crisis be perceived as an opportunity? Following on Arnaldo's question, can there be such a thing as a clear narrative of crisis as opportunity? If that were the case, an opportunity for what? Should the idea of opportunity be interpreted solely in economic terms? In Adiós a la Economía, the book that you were just quoting, Goodbye to Economics, Puerto Rican political economist Miriam Muñiz asks, what is economics good for? And she answers, it exists to sustain a convenient mode of crisis. Is there such a thing as a politics beyond economics? What is the economic, but furthermore, the political potential of refusing to pay the debt?
Well, I think yes. You could think of what we could think of the crisis as an opportunity. I would rephrase it in terms of I see the crisis as an invitation to think radically, or rethink things radically about economics, about politics, and about the relationship between politics and economics. One good question is the question that Frances was posing just before me, which is what would be a solution to the crisis? Is a solution to the crisis, sometimes we define the crisis in Puerto Rico as the stagnation of Puerto Rico's economy since 2006. You could go back to 1996 when Section 936 of the U.S. Tax Code was eliminated, which was one of the mechanisms for promoting U.S. investment in Puerto Rico. So is the solution to the crisis going back to what existed before 2006 or going back to what existed before 1996? This is what the solution would be. I would say, you could ask whether that's possible or not. I think that even if it were possible, I don't think it's desirable. For the longest time, as Juan was indicating, Puerto Rico's economy has been shaped, to put it diplomatically, by the presence of U.S. capital. And that has had several consequences. One of them is the fact that a considerable part of the profits generated in Puerto Rico, the income generated in Puerto Rico, flows out of Puerto Rico. It's not reinvested in Puerto Rico. A further consequence of that is that all through the 20th century and up to the present, that type of economy has never been able to provide employment for most of the Puerto Rican labor force. Before 1996, in the good times, before 1996, we have a 13-14% unemployment rate in Puerto Rico, a 45% poverty level in Puerto Rico. We had terrible situation in Puerto Rico. So what I'm trying to point out, I could give you more examples. What I'm trying to point out is that the crisis has intensified a whole set of problems, but it has not created them. So the crisis, I think, should be the occasion for addressing not the intensification of the problem, but the problem itself. That we have to question that structure which is in crisis, not simply trying to restart that mechanism somehow. And in that sense, I think we have to move in the direction. Well, to use some of the terms that were mentioned before, I think we cannot simply aspire to have an economy that grows. To restart Puerto Rican growth in the Puerto Rican economy. We need economic development, but not only economic development. We need what we would call sustainable economic development. That is to redefine what we mean by development, and that's a considerable task. I think that nothing short of a very profound plan of economic reconstruction for Puerto Rico will do. A plan that has to include many things, but the main question right now in the situation of the debt of the crisis, the debt crisis, is the problem of how do you finance social and economic reconstruction. I think the financing has to come from renegotiating the debt. That is an issue we'll bring up later on the other questions, how you go about doing that. You have to finance by taxing some of the profits that leave Puerto Rico now, and you have to recuperate them for the Puerto Rican economy. And I also think that there has to be a federal government input into reconstructing the Puerto Rican economy.
We used to have a debate decades ago in political philosophy. Does being determine consciousness, or does consciousness determine being? Do the ideas that people have, are they a result of their conditions, or do they independently develop their ideas to shape their conditions? I've always been a believer that being determines consciousness. The lack of hope of the Puerto Rican people is a result of the reality that they have seen now for decades of this stagnation, and the leadership has not provided a way out. They can't find jobs, and so those who want to have a better future are unfortunately voting with their feet. And I think that what we've got to grasp is that we're only at the beginning of a deepening crisis, right? In another few days, the governor of Puerto Rico is going to round up all the little tricks that they have of switching money from here to there. They've already started announcing they're going to reduce hours at the work days for they can't pay anything. In the next few months, it's going to get worse and worse. So that therefore, those economic conditions are going to increase the impact on the consciousness of Puerto Ricans on the island, of Puerto Ricans in the United States, and most importantly, and this is where I believe is the opportunity, on the American people. The American people, for the most part, never think at all about Puerto Rico except to go on vacation, right? And the leaders in Congress couldn't give a damn about what happens there. This crisis is forcing everyone to re-examine relationships, and I believe that that is a positive step. It's unfortunate that it took a crisis like this, but once it has occurred, as we used to say decades and decades ago, seize the time. Grab the moment to educate people about what is actually going on. So I think that that this is an important opportunity to change consciousness, to change understandings, and that it's going to, and the opportunity is going to increase over the next few months and years. And of course, you cannot devise a simple solution to a complex problem. But again, going back to my old teachings from prior eras, when you have a whole group of problems and contradictions, there's inevitably a principal contradiction. There's inevitably a fundamental one. Don't get deviated by the minor ones or the ones that tend to grab you first. dig deep, analyze well, and figure out what is the fundamental contradiction occurring right here. And since the fundamental contradiction right now is the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, I am not saying that that's going to be resolved today or the next few years, but all solutions should be guided by what are the solutions that advance the sovereignty of Puerto Rico as opposed to those that retard the sovereignty of Puerto Rico. Any solution that helps to mobilize the people of Puerto Rico and also to, because, you know, the Vieques struggle, which was a shining moment in the history of the Puerto Rican nation, brought everyone together. But it didn't start out that way. It started out with all kinds of different groups having different perspectives, but gradually everyone was forced to accept that the only solution was to get the Navy out of Vieques. The Navy got so pissed off, they said, okay, you don't want us in Vieques, we're closing Roosevelt Roads. You know, we're gonna get all our bases, as many as we can out. Fine, well, they did that. But the thing is, so I believe that the issue is understand the principal contradiction, figure out what, not the exact roadmap, but what direction is the best direction to head in. And I think it's in the direction of finding solutions that promote the existing reality that there are two nations here. There's one sovereignty right now, but there are two nations involved. And so what are the ones that recognize the reality that these are two nations with two cultures and two histories, but with incredible ties as a result of this long colonial relationship. And those solutions that move in that direction will be better than the ones that move in the other direction.
Well, I think there's a big debate about whether there is such a thing as a fundamental contradiction that organizes all the other contradictions. And I think, again, going back to the questions more than the solutions, I think when people are leaving Puerto Rico, they're might be saying a number of things. One of them is that they have no faith in the political or politicians or in their representatives. They might be saying that Puerto Rico's economic problems are very deeply structural, and not only in relation to the framework of colonialism, but largely in relation to the global economic system. In preparing for the other forum, I did a little thinking about the impact of debt in the Caribbean. And I realized that debt has been a constant companion in the Caribbean since the Spanish started settling there. Think about Haiti. Haiti unleashed the first revolution by enslaved people. It was a remarkable feat of imagination. Mm-hmm. Which had huge repercussions in other parts of the world, and then was saddled with debt that it didn't pay off till the 20th century. Think about Jamaica recently was having debates about whether Britain should pay them reparations, because when the slavery was abolished in Jamaica, the slave owners were compensated, but not the people who were slaves. And then you think about Puerto Rico, 500 plus years of post-colonial settlement. And if you think about that period that everybody calls the economic miracle period, and you put in the context about the entire period, Puerto Rico has been in debt or mired in structural poverty due to its insertion in the global economy and its relation to more than one empire during practically its entire history. So, going back to fast forward to the present. So, one of the things that I feel that Puerto Ricans are saying when they're leaving is that they also don't have much faith in the categories of modernity like nationhood or nation-state status or sovereignty. Now, if you look at the world right now, there's a huge crisis of sovereignty in Europe due to the massive refugee crisis. So it seems to me that, again, we're in a challenging position if people are not willing to stay in Puerto Rico to fight for the nation state. They're not willing to invest the enormous energy and sacrifice that it might entail to create a mass movement to that end, and they prefer to save themselves and save the nation, then my question is, doesn't seem that the nation-state idea is mobilizing people to the sacrifice necessary that organization requires, and that they're moving in huge numbers to the United States, which is the colonial power, complicating further the relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. Through the fact that there's already more than 1 million people from Puerto Rico, more than the island in the United States. So if the exodus continues, you're going to have the situation that you might have half of the people living in the United States versus the other half living in Puerto Rico. And that is a very novel situation for Puerto Rico. And I think it poses new questions about who are the people? How are they constituted? Where are they going? So again, I think I have questions about how do we conceive of this particular scenario politically, because it seems like from the Puerto Rico side, one of the things that might have to shift is that people might even have to think of themselves to build such a coalition among various sectors affected by global capital, because it's not only national. I mean, looking at it as a U.S.-Puerto Rico problem exclusively, I think is a limited analysis, because this is a global problem. The U.S. and Puerto Rico are both parts of the global economy in different positions. So there are dynamics of power between, but there's also broader dynamics at play. That so the U.S. sovereignty itself, and even U.S. politics, I think it's debatable if you can separate it from corporate America. So that question of if there's such a thing about politics with, apart from economics, I don't think so at this point. So then that also begs the question: then if the monster is a lot more complex, and so part of our lives and so internalized, and it's global in its dimensions, how do we think about it? How do people in Puerto Rico think about their situation in relation to the U.S.? How do you organize with people in the U.S. when you think of yourself as separate? Anyway, I think those are challenges. I don't have solutions, but I do have a lot of questions that I think thinking it through might get us somewhere, maybe, hopefully.
Does this particular debt crisis put in crisis our understanding of colonialism and sovereignty? Is there a way out of thinking debt through crisis? Is not crisis the operative capitalist sovereign mode of action, which has become sort of like the mantra of the night? Furthermore, are there ways to think of possible solutions? The word solution now doesn't seem so good to me anymore. I'm educating myself by listening to you guys. Are there ways to think of ideas that go beyond the usual partisan political party organizing principles of statehood, independence, and commonwealth, or Estado Libre Asociado? Are there ways to politicize our response that do not fit these predictable scripts? And if there are, what would they be?
I think there are two basic, very complex issues in this question. One of them pertains to a very general question of whether capitalism is compatible with sovereignty, whichever way we define it. And the other one pertains to the debate in Puerto Rico about sovereignty. Well, regarding the first issue, if you define sovereignty very broadly as having some sort of individual or collective control over processes that affect you, or the economic processes that affects you in this case, I think that capitalism is very much in contradiction with any notion of sovereignty. If only look at the situation of capitalist crisis. This is a type of crisis that nobody wants. Workers don't want it. They don't want to be unemployed. But even employers do not want it either. They don't want to see their profits go down. Bankers don't want it. Office holders don't want it. Nobody wants it. And yet, it's an economic process in which we find ourselves immersed and trapped in. It's a very dramatic demonstration that the economics or the economic process has become a mechanism which controls us. We don't control it. And that it subjects us to terrible circumstances periodically and sometimes chronically. I think we have to demand sovereignty. We have to demand democratic control over economic processes that affect us. And that in that sense, I think we have to refuse the choice, the false choice, I would say, that is dominant, the neoliberal choice, you could call it, that which argues that we only have two options. We are either subordinate to the rules of the market, of the impersonal market, this mechanism that controls our lives, or we can be subordinate to a bureaucratic planning regime. These are the two options. There's no other option. I think we have to insist that there is a third option. The third option is a democratic organization of the economic process, and that such a thing is an alternative. It's the alternative that we need in Puerto Rico, in the United States, and everywhere. It's not a problem that's going to be solved next month, but I think we have to have that perspective so we can push in that direction. Now, in Puerto Rico, the issue of sovereignty is more often than not reduced to the issue of the relationship with the United States, which is a very important issue. But I think it has to be broadened. I think the sovereignty issue is much broader than that. It has to include things that we can address within the existing relationship with the United States, whatever you think about it. And it has to include issues that would not be changed by merely changing the relationship with the United States. For example, if Puerto Rico were to become independent, I would say that doesn't ensure it's going to be sovereign. In the present world, to have political independence is hardly enough to really have control over the economic processes that go on in the territory that you inhabit. So the question of sovereignty has to include what we call normally the status question, but it includes many other things. So, the workers' rights in the point of production, women's and other people's reproductive rights, sexual rights, all sorts of things that have to do with the control that people have over their own lives, and that we have to bring up and organize around, even within the present relationship with the US. And the question of how do we determine where the Puerto Rican economy goes is not simply solved. It's an important part of the changes that we can make, but it's not simply solved by becoming sovereign in a formal sense. The political movement that I belong to precisely is based on the notion that we should today organize people around those issues, the issues of sovereignty, taking control over our lives, without placing at the center of that political project the question of independence or the question of the political status of Puerto Rico. It's what makes it a little bit different from the other political parties. And I conclude that we might, to join the group with more questions than answers, there is a sort of paradox here, I think. Or there could be a sort of interesting paradox, which is that political parties in Puerto Rico have traditionally been organized around the status question. And yet, even though they're organized around that issue, they have never been able to solve it.
That's the
And
idea.
maybe the way to finally do something about it is not to organize around it, to organize around the notion that we have to take control of our lives, control of our communities, control of our economy, and we will get to that issue through that type of organization, but not placing at the center of our political project at this stage, whether we are for independence or statehood or autonomy or whatever. And I think that to struggle for that type of economic change also helps us construct which I think we should construct, which is alliances and coordination with similar movements in the United States, which I know it's a global movement, but there's no I don't think that we need to speak too much to indicate that it's the relationship with social movements in the United States is particularly important for us, because we are interacting and we are making demands on the same institutions, the US Congress, the federal government, and so on and so forth, and the US courts. I have to say something about what Juan said before, which I think is very important, but I think I should wait till later, or should I say now?
Say that.
No, I tend to speak too much, that's why I'm asking. Well, no, what I'm saying is I agree with Juan that we have to seize the moment, and an important way of seizing the moment in Puerto Rico is for there to be significant mobilizations in Puerto Rico. What made the moment of Vieques important is that people mobilized. There was civil disobedience, there were pickets, there were marches, there were concentrations, there were all sorts of activities to dramatize, to send a message that there's a very strong movement in Puerto Rico, very strong feeling that something has to be done. If I were to criticize the Puerto Rican government, one of the things I would criticize the most is the lack of that. I'll give you a very specific example. The government of Puerto Rico approved legislation so that Puerto Rico would have its own bankruptcy law. We'll get into that later. So that it could create a framework for renegotiating its debt. The creditors immediately went to the federal court to challenge that and to have that declared unconstitutional, which they succeeded in doing. Those of us who come from social movements know that if you have an issue which is in the hands of a judge, you don't sit in your house waiting to see what the judge is going to say. You mobilize. You have a picket. You go to the. So if the government of Puerto Rico thinks that this legislation is important for Puerto Rico right now, and the legislation is in court, is in federal court, then the government of Puerto Rico should mobilize people. Should mobilize people so they make sure that the federal judge who's going to make this decision knows there's 200, 300, 400,000 people outside the court saying we need this legislation so that Puerto Rico can move forward. But the government of Puerto Rico doesn't do that. Instead of working with the unions and the social movements, it fights them. And needless to say, this is, I think, to the advantage of the creditors. They do mobilize very well to make sure that in this case, the courts make decisions in their favor, in favor of their interests.
Have we changed our conceptions of colonialism and sovereignty? That question has to be posed not just to us here and people concerned about Puerto Rico. It has to be posed to the American people. I always want to focus on this. We've got to also wage the battle in the narrative among the American public, because there's two sides. there's two major populations that are going to have to deal with this problem. What do you do when you have a colony that you no longer need? Which is what the United States now has. It's had this colony for 117 years, and it no longer needs it. Not for military purposes, not for cheap labor purposes, not for all the purposes that Puerto Rico was originally acquired, does the United States any longer need it. So that question has to be posed to the American people, you know, and I say this is a great situation where the American public, Puerto Rico has never been in the news, never in its history, as much as it has been in the last 4 or 5 months. And it's going to continue to be in the news. And so people are going to have to, one way or another, form an opinion that they never had before. And one of the questions that should be drilled into the American public is, what is Puerto Rico? You know, why do we continue to have this territory that doesn't quite fit all the other definitions of what what a territory of the United States is? And if we no longer need it, why do we have it as a possession, as a territorial possession? And I think that so that the question of changing definitions is not just of sovereignty, but it is also of colonialism and the kind of colonial powers that we have. On the debt issue, remember, debt was always the reason for U.S. intervention in Latin America. When the United States went into the Dominican Republic the first time, in the early 1900s, it was over the failure of the Dominican government to pay the debts it had been pushed into borrowing. When the United States went into Nicaragua in the early 1920s, it went into Nicaragua over the failure of the Nicaraguan government to pay the bonds and debts that it had been pushed by Wall Street to acquire. So debt is always an excuse for intervention and for determining the policies of countries. Now they no longer need troops these days. They have much more sophisticated ways to control an economy. And so yes, the definition of what is an independent nation has dramatically changed. But I do think that I agree with Rafael that this issue of democratization, empowering the people, what I believe is about the issue about sovereignty, pushing in the directions of sovereignty, pushing in the direction of solutions that empower the people. And some of them are very easy. Why is the Virgin Islands exempt from the Jones Act and Puerto Rico is not? Why is that? They're both territories of the United States, but one is exempt from the Jones Act and the other one has to abide by the Jones Act. And you know, there's no defense of that. Unfortunately, the political leaders who are fashioning the current proposed solution have chosen not to raise the issue of the Jones Act. Why? Because they're the labor movement in the United States, the Merchant Marine Union, wants the Jones Act because it protects their jobs. The Merchant Marine Union has convinced the AFL-CIO not to say anything about it. The AFL-CIO has convinced the Puerto Rican leaders not to raise the issue. So the issue of the Jones Act is being put on the side while they talk about bankruptcy protection and earned income tax credit and equalizing Medicaid and Medicare. But getting rid of the Jones Act would enable Puerto Rico to develop its commerce and its trade in the way that it sees fit. That's why I say you look for the solutions that push you further in terms of empowering your own population. The other one that I've raised repeatedly is the separate solution that is being negotiated over the bonds of PREPA, of the electric company, the Puerto Rico Electric Company. The bondholders they're willing to take a haircut. They're trying to negotiate a deal with the Puerto Rico government at 85 cents on the dollar because they want to turn Puerto Rico, which now has about, I was inaccurate in my presentation, I said like 80%, it's about 57% or so of Puerto Rico's electricity is produced through oil and about another 25% through natural gas. They want to move everything into natural gas when the reality is that an electrical system that was sustainable and in the interest of the sovereignty of the Puerto Rican people would neither depend on oil nor gas, but on wind and sun. You create an electrical system where you no longer depend constantly on importing fossil fuels to run the lights and the air conditioning and all of the energy of your country. So the solution for PREPA has to be, and activists should be fighting, not to accept any deal that ties Puerto Rico constantly to the international oil cartel, and one that promotes wind and power and sustainable energy, which will drive down prices and cut the ties to the United States. So I think that's what I'm saying is you can have solutions that empower the people, that move you in a better direction than where you are right now.
Thank you so much. It has been a fantastic, incredible panel. Very informative. I have learned a lot, but at the same time, as a retired educator, both in Puerto Rico, in Europe, and here in the United States, my concern is always education. Education, education. What is happening on the island about education? I don't hear the University of Puerto Rico protesting, the School of Sociology, the School of Law. I don't hear the doctors in the School of Medicine protesting about the health insurances issues that we're having now. So what is happening with the education of the people? Uneducated people cannot move forward positively for their own sake individually, as well as for the sake of their own nation.
First of all, I am sort of in a sort of contradiction here, because I am, as everybody knows, a supporter of independence of Puerto Rico. Yet I belong, and I am the candidate for governor of a party that does not defend the independence of Puerto Rico. It doesn't defend any particular status at the present moment. And I think speaking now as an independentista, we have to think about this. I think we have to start from the very basic reality, which I have to point out. It's very painful, but not more than 3 or 4% of the Puerto Rican people support independence at this moment. And I think it's pointless to try and build a movement in this emergency situation that the requisite to belong to that movement is that you support the independence of Puerto Rico. At the same time that this is a reality, there is a considerable amount of people who want to protect the environment in Puerto Rico, who are against privatization in Puerto Rico, who want to stop the privatization of public schools, which is on the table right now, the model of the charter school in the US and so on. People who are for gay rights, people who are for protecting the environment, people who are for renewable energy in Puerto Rico and so on. I think we have to organize on that basis, without those of us who support independence in any way hiding or stopping to talk about the need for independence. Well, we have to build a movement on that basis, which I call a movement for self-determination, because all of those movements, if you look at them, are trying to, as Juan said, empower people, have people being able to decide what they want to do with the the place where they live, which happens to be Puerto Rico in this case. And we will come, in the process of doing that, we will unavoidably come to the issue of what relationship we want to have with the United States. But we don't start with that issue, with the definition of that. We will end up there as part of a common struggle. Regarding education, we don't have much time, but there are many groups in Puerto Rico that are active, I have to say. For example, there is a Colegio de Médicos y Cirujanos, which is a organization basically of progressive doctors who are very much in the struggle for a universal health, single payer type insurance in Puerto Rico, and who try to educate people on the drawbacks of the privatized health system that we have and the benefits of a universal healthcare system. In the same fashion, there are teacher organizations who are struggling against this attempt to fragment and semi-privatize the education system and so on. But I have to say that it is the reality that the last few years have been, as always happens in many places, at some particular moment, period of relative demobilization. In the case of education, it's a very tragic situation. Up to 2006, we have a very strong, very big, relatively democratic teachers union, the Federación de Maestros, and as a result of the defeat of the strike in 2006, which we can talk about, but I cannot talk about it here now, the organization of the teachers is very much fragmented. Where there was once one organization, there are now 4 organizations, all of which are relatively small, and they don't have the same capacity to mobilize as the other groups had in the past. So it's something that we have to rebuild. The labor movement, rebuild many movements in Puerto Rico. There's no question about that. But it's not a desert. There are initiatives going on which I cannot detail now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what you meant by education, but one of the symptoms of the crisis has been the closing of schools, the cramming of more students with less, fewer teachers, more students per room. And in fact, when I was in Aguadilla not long ago, I mean, the example or the metaphor of the crisis was you see the school, they're all been closed, right? But there's something that Joel Cintrón and Carla Minet said in the forum at Columbia that I thought was very important, which of course they're journalists, and so by profession they're geared to this question, but I thought it was compelling, which they felt that the level of information that people have about what's going on is minimal.
Yes, Lord.
And without information, it's very difficult to mobilize. And some of the symptoms of this lack of information is the government doesn't inform people what's going on. They told stories about going to government officials and saying who holds the debt and how much and where are they, and they would say, I don't remember. When they had already met these people several times, of course they know who they are and what's going on. So there is a problem, a very fundamental problem at the level of the state, not informing its citizens of what is taking place. And I think part of that is because they're figuring it out for themselves. Basically, they don't want too much information to go out. So in that regard, I think that one of the mobilizing questions for me, that's I think a radical one, which is education and information. So you mentioned the audit, I think one that seems like a small thing, but a demand for an accountability for how we got here would be an empowering process of public information and mobilization. You start being able to craft the narrative if you have more information. You start to be able to map the relationship between players and structures. And maybe it's not how you think it is. Maybe it's in another direction. So I would say that that is a radical question. What about education?
Yes.
What about information?
Thank you.
Juan, you want to answer?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously, one of the things that's happened, and I think Rafael alluded to this, is that everyone takes advantage of crises for different reasons. The Puerto Rican government a few weeks ago introduced a bill that would attempt to essentially privatize about 15% of the public school systems as a means of shrinking the amount of the responsibility that they have to fund the public schools. There are, and of course, the bondholders all love that. They want more of that, and I think that But I want to get back for a moment to this issue I didn't get a chance to speak on, which was the law issue. The law is a reflection of the power relations in a society at any given time. And therefore, what's legal and illegal always has to be taken into context that legality changes. One of the examples I raised about this issue of bankruptcy for Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico did have the right to exercise bankruptcy between 1937 and 1984. When the original bankruptcy laws were created by Congress in the 1930s to allow municipal governments who were under the strain of the Great Depression to file for bankruptcy, Puerto Rico was specifically, all the territories of the United States were specifically included as being able to file for bankruptcy. What happened, which has been very hardly reported, no one knows about it, except if you've read some of the court papers on this, is that in 1984, there was amendments to the bankruptcy law. Strom Thurmond, who was then in the Senate, the notorious racist from South Carolina, inserted an amendment into the bankruptcy laws that specifically did not allow Puerto Rico to file for bankruptcy, specifically aimed at Puerto Rico, supported by Bob Dole, and in the middle of the night, the United States Senate, in a big bill, passed this law that took away from Puerto Rico the same right that all of the other states had with their municipalities. That's an example of legality, colonialism masking as legality.
Do you know why? I mean, this question came up in the forum and nobody knew the answer to why.
No, I believe, I haven't gotten that deeply into it, but I believe that it was probably at the request of financiers who were eager to peddle more debt to Puerto Rico. That would make it easier for them to sell those bonds because there would be less chance of Puerto Rico being able to default on them. But in the appeals, the Boston Appeals Court decision against the Puerto Rican government on bankruptcy, Judge Torruella specifically mentioned that, even though he had to support it, but Judge Torruella specifically said the majority's disregard for the arbitrary and unreasonable nature of the legislation enacted in the 1984 amendments showcases again this court's approval of a relationship under which Puerto Rico lacks any national political representation in both houses of Congress and is wanting of electoral rights. This is clearly a colonial relationship, one which violates the Constitution. That was Judge Torruella speaking in the first Court of Appeal. So I think that this whole issue of legality and illegality, we got to get this stuff out to people. Puerto Rico did have bankruptcy protection before. It was just taken away arbitrarily by Congress. Why can they not reinstitute it now? What's the big deal? And it's all a question of people understanding how the colonial relationship works. Things happen that people don't know about, and then the people of Puerto Rico pay the consequences.